Thank you very much, Professor Caffo, for this very comprehensive overview. It is now a privilege for me to introduce one of the leaders of the mental health movement in Europe, the advisor for mental health at the regional office of the World Health Organization in Copenhagen, Dr. Matthijs Muijen, who has been the main organizer of the famous Helsinki Ministerial Conference on Mental Health, which took place in January 2005, and which has produced the Mental Health Declaration and Mental Health Action Plan for Europe, which are the two most important policy documents that we have in our field, in our continent. The title of Dr. Muijen's presentation will be indeed Beyond Helsinki. Matt Muijen.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Professor Caffo, for bringing this day to fruition. We've been talking about this for 6 months, and it's one of these days you think, well, it probably will never happen. It's very ambitious, and here we are in one of the most beautiful rooms in the world. I think I've been in a room where Paganini played, but I don't think I've quite been in a room where the greatest artists of the world were present. And also notice one drawing of probably a duke who was signing a document which is prophetic for today. Now, the other reason why today is important is that this is an occasion that's actually bringing together for the first time a number of intergovernmental organizations and professional organizations, all committed to the same purpose. And sadly, the European Commission cannot be here, but I have been mandated by them to convey their very best wishes by Jürgen Schäfflein and by Michael Hugbel of DG Sanko, who also apologized themselves because they're on holiday, and they actually tried to change their holiday to be in Florence, but could not quite manage to do so. They also say that since WHO and the Commission have developed a very close collaboration in this field, they asked me to convey their full support for this conference and its objectives, and their commitment to work together in the future. And what I'm saying is a statement that is really on behalf of the WHO as well as the EC. Now, Professor Caffo and also Professor May mentioned the Helsinki Declaration, which came out in January 2005 and has been signed on behalf of 53 ministers of health. And I have to say, somewhat to my surprise, this declaration has actually been taken quite seriously in many countries and is leading to action. And later I will be saying that this is a potential to push for further action in the field of child psychiatry. And these are some of the key points that are actually stated in the Helsinki Declaration. The Helsinki Declaration is quite specific on content in the area of child mental health. And this is only a short summary of some of the points ministers have signed. The developing of mental health services sensitive to the needs of young people, but also working in partnership with other agencies. The restriction of institutional approaches, the improvement of quality of mental health services, particularly looking at the needs of people requiring specialist care and the need to educate specialists. And also the last point, which I think is a very important point, which should pushing in its own right, ensuring the parity of funding in relation to comparable healthcare. And later on I will make a point that I doubt that's the case. Now the other document, which is in preparation at the moment, but which is again exceedingly important, is the EC Green Paper, which again contains a lot of content about life course and mental health promotion and prevention related to children. And this will be published as a communication as the mental health strategy of the European Commission in a few months' time, and very important to look out for and for all of us to work with, because again it gives us an opportunity. And what is so interesting is the convergence of our interests, because Professor Caffo just summarized the Firenze Declaration. And again, I summarize here myself what I perceive as the key points of this declaration: the need for coherence in Europe, the importance of creating networks of all these different agencies active in mental health. It needs to be evidence-based, the attention for individual differences, but also the flexibility to deal with new cultures. Now, this is actually a point where I want to pause for a moment, because all of this can be rhetoric that slips easily off the tongue, and you'll be hearing it an awful lot. What we are preoccupied with all the time is the tension between some of these areas. And this is the kind of tension child psychiatry is very aware of, always a postmodern idea of mixing everything up. But we are constantly trying to reconcile the evidence base we are looking for, the individual wishes of consumers, children, adults, but also the cultural expectations of groups that is becoming more and more prominent. And what we tend to ignore is the contradiction between all these three areas which we have to give attention to. Evidence-based is not acceptable in its implementation to quite a few people. Cultural differences can be very contradictory. And this is even more important in child mental health than it can be in areas that are relying on greater technology. Now, of course, the reason for all this, for all these declarations, for this conference, is that we are concerned about the state of child mental health and the reality about the state of mental health altogether. And the reasons for this concern, from our perspective, is first of all the evidence, and this is a conference in its own right really, what this means, but the apparent evidence of growing prevalence and suffering year by year, and certainly, if one looks back over the decades, it has increased, the suffering of children. But also the lifespan consequences. Unless we intervene now in children, we are building up problems for in 20, 30 years' time. We are concerned because the response is remarkably inadequate, what we actually are offering these children. And finally, I am perplexed as an adult psychiatrist who has been working on policy and service delivery for several decades now, about the lack of knowledge and information, in particularly child mental health. There is a big, big challenge for research and epidemiological work in this area. And that has led to a number of obstacles which I think can explain why mental health is doing so comparatively poorly in terms of attention and investment. It's first of all that I think policymakers and key decision makers do not know. They do not know the state of affairs. Why spend money on something no one is actually really telling them about? And that leads to neglect and discrimination. But there's another more subtle point. And I came across yesterday about an important primary care paper produced by the Committee on Social Determinants at WHO. And it made a point that increasingly attention needs to be given to aging in the population. And one of the reasons they gave is that in 2005, the proportion of mortality due to young children is 19%. In 25 years, in 2030, the mortality due to children will only be 9%. Now, on face value, what that strongly suggests is a shift of resources from childcare to old age, through adolescence. And these are the kind of figures that on the face of it are valid, but they're actually very important to interpret correctly. And this is one of the problems we are creating to an extent ourselves, WHO, because they can be wrongly interpreted. And this is a famous graph of DALYs in Europe, which are heavily weighted towards mortality. And what you can see is that the second cause of DALYs are neuropsychiatric disorders. But these are neuropsychiatric disorders of adults. And if you actually start looking for child mortality, for child diseases, you can find that I actually have to go below the bar I normally use. I go for the top 10 or the 2%. And the first specific child group is perinatal conditions, which is 1.8% of the burden of disease in Europe. Now, why these figures are so dangerous is that they are highly misleading because they weigh towards specific conditions. Because, of course, what it ignores is that the burden of disease worldwide of children mental health problems is massive. And it's actually growing because we reduce the mortality. And because we reduce the mortality in children, there is actually an even greater need to look at non-communicable diseases and problems such as, well, conduct disorder, which has a massive prevalence and growing prevalence. And this neglect of these childhood disorders, which are very often chronic, is clearly a major negative consequence for the future. This is for me an enormously important study done by WHO, the health behavior of school children across Europe. And what this shows is that, and this is increasing again, that 35% of young people across Europe are being involved in bullying others, and about the same, 35%, interestingly, has been bullied by other people in the last couple of months. And one can belittle that and say that it's good for people. Personally, I remember having been bullied at school for 2 or 3 days over 12 years, and it has made a lifelong impact on me. And I think these kind of factors, again, tend to be belittled because they do not lead to mortality, and as a consequence are not sufficiently taken seriously by policymakers. But there is another bit, which is the interface between well-being overall and child mental health. And this is a list I took from an excellent book on well-being recently, which summarizes the key factors that determine well-being in adults. We recognize them all: employment, marital status, ethnicity, status, and country. And in passing, country is actually the most important factor of all of determining happiness. But why I show you this graph of this list is that these factors are also very powerfully, directly connected to the well-being and the happiness and the depression and the misery of children, because the quality of life, the well-being of parents and adults is very directly associated with the behavior and the future behavior of children. Country is interesting. I mean, I'm at the moment living in Denmark, which is, I think, number 2, and it shows in my children, who are remarkably happy there. Again, a factor well worth looking into more. But why this is so important is that these factors, such as employment, ethnicity, and country, are also related to factors at birth, such as thinness at birth, which in turn is correlated to social class, which predicts any disease you want to think about. This graph shows you the correlation between social class and thinness and birth and incidence of cardiovascular disease in later life. But exactly the same slide I could show for depression and other childhood mental health disorders. So one cannot see child's mental health in isolation. It's directly correlated to adult conditions, and we have to take great care about the lifelong consequences, the life course of these diseases. Now, sadly, and I have to say this is a truism about mental health care as a whole, in no way is this identified need we have just been talking about met by the quality of services. I have to say that the quality of research is, again, disconcertingly poor. But what comes across consistently is that only about, let's say, 10 to 20% of young people with mental health problems receive care from mental health services, which means that a large proportion do not receive any form of care. This is far worse than adult disorders. People with severe depression get care in only 50%, which I think is appallingly low. But it's an awful lot better than what is being received by children. And I want to show you a first glimpse at some of the results of a WHO baseline questionnaire, which we did in partnership with the European Commission, about the state of affair of childhood mental health. And this is still an analysis, so this is the first time I show this figure to anyone, which is, first of all, the availability in care, which shows that most countries do have a range of facilities. You can see 74% of countries have day treatment facilities. Most countries have residential facilities. Some kind of hospital beds are also available. But below that glimpsy picture, there's actually a consistent number of concerns about the inadequacy of these services. They're understaffed. They have often provisions for an inappropriate mixture of clients, mental disorders and learning disabilities. The next one I find quite intriguing. Children and adolescents still receive treatment in adult services. And, well, as half a joke, we actually put in numbers behind it between the two outliers. So there are 6 children in mixed facilities in Cyprus and almost 1 million in Russia. And another consistent bit of information we found from across countries is that provisions are so diverse. They're inconsistent. We cannot talk about European child psychiatry. I'm not even sure we can talk about national child psychiatry. Child psychiatry is remarkably diverse. Now, that's also linked to this. ASCAP is about European child psychiatry. But again, if one looks at the variety, and this is obviously done per 100,000 of the population, if you look at the variety of the number of psychiatrists about Europe, it's startling. What we also have done is that we have showed here the proportion of child psychiatrists, well, the comparison of child psychiatrists in blue against all psychiatrists in purple. And you can see an enormous fluctuation. We left in Uzbekistan. Because it suggests they have more child psychiatrists than all psychiatrists together. And this is published data, which is just a lesson in appraisal of research. This is clearly untrue. But it comes up again and again in publications as an example of good provision of child psychiatry in Europe. And one bit of positive news, which I pass on very quickly because Professor Kaffe has already mentioned this, is that actually specialist training is good news. 90% of countries provide specialist training for psychiatrists and 63% of countries for psychologists. And the countries not providing this kind of care are particularly the ex-Soviet Union countries. Now, at this point, what we would have liked to show you is the investment in child psychiatry per country. And we tried. We looked at the literature. I even found contact in a number of countries. We tried it in our questionnaire, and no one knows. It's really quite worrying. What we have been able to put together, and this is actually a European Commission slide, is investment of psychiatry as a whole in country. So this is the proportion of total health expenditure for the whole of mental health in countries. What we have no idea about is what proportion of this is invested in child psychiatry, and I suspect that's already one big challenge to start on working after this conference, because without that kind of evidence, it's actually very hard to make any powerful points about making change. So, 2 more overheads, and this is about the way forward. Now, these are the challenges put in the Firenze, a bit pretentious, the Florence Declaration, and what WHO believes really should be looked at over the next few years. And the first one is actually the scope and the responsibilities of the challenge we are taking on in child psychiatry. The frustration I begin to have as being responsible for mental health at WHO, that pretty much everything is becoming my responsibility. Mental health promotion, prevention, the well-being of the population in general, mental illness, child psychiatry, autism, epilepsy. What do you believe at child psychiatry is your scope, and what is the responsibility of psychiatrists and possibly psychologists within those boundaries? Because you cannot take on everything and you will be ineffective. The second question is clearly the human rights question, and again, what standards should be expected based on existing human rights legislation? A challenge to take on in partnership with the Council of Europe, because again, we know about the human rights, but we rarely know what it actually means in practice, and how we hold our governments to account. The third point is again about promotion and prevention. We have been very active in this area, but I'm struggling to find the hard evidence of specific interventions and the costing. Again, an area which should be close to your heart and requires further work. Services and training is obvious. What is actually a service for Europe? Or do we want diversity as it is? There's an argument for both, but I think there needs to be a statement about that. And my last 2 points, increasingly close to my heart. We need to identify what evidence is a priority and what is required, and funding will become available. The EC has grants and is willing to invest, and I'm not speaking here on behalf of the EC, by the way, but I know how they work. There are grants provided the questions are clear. And the last plea here is the appalling lack of information about what is happening in child psychiatry across Europe, and without that information it is very difficult to make any political impact and create any power for child psychiatry. So my very final point is a plea for future partnership and collaboration between ASCAP, the WHO, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, and I hope organizations like Autism International and many other specialist agencies. You need to take charge. You need to take responsibility to push this forward. No one else is going to do it for you, and you can either take a position of a victim complaining no one acts on your behalf, or you can make strong representations, and people will be listening to you because people really are concerned about their children. You have to build these partnerships, and my last point is that the most effective way of creating change is to come up with a specific action plan that is evidence-based and politically relevant and costed. And if that is being put on the table, politicians will be only too keen to support you, and you will actually be able to affect change. And WHO would be delighted, very happy to work with you on that process. Thank you very much.